Thank you, and hello, everyone. So I really appreciate the information that Tom provided to us, and it really helps me to kind of get a perspective as to what we can expect across the country, and in particular in my area. I'm in Reno, Nevada, western, in the rain shadow, actually, of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So we have very, very limited precipitation here, usually less than 7 inches per year, and a lot of that it falls as snowfall during the winter. So during the growing season, when our plants are actively growing and photosynthesizing, we don't get a lot of natural precipitation. So I'm going to be talking from that perspective and give you some things to think about with regards to what trees require and why it's so important, especially in really dry areas, to pay attention to how you irrigate them. So basically, I'm going to cover the impact of drought and water limitations on trees, and then how to grow drought-resilient trees in the landscape, not how to grow them in nurseries, but basically how to make them more drought-resilient once they're planted into the landscape. And then finally, the most effective strategies for irrigating those trees and why it's really critical that we do that, especially in arid areas. So, basically, we're killing our trees, especially in our area where our precipitation is so low. This here is a photograph of a blue spruce that was in a landscape where the homeowner decided to remove the turf grass because of water shortages and wanting to conserve and save money. And then they removed the turf grass, which means that that was probably the main source of irrigation for that tree, put down some rock and a few ground cover plants and called it good. Didn't replace any irrigation around that tree. And as you can see, the result was a dead tree. And I think the really important critical information to take from this is that turf grass irrigation is relatively shallow and frequent, and tree roots grow much deeper than turf grass roots. And so we really do have to pay attention, even if there is turf grass in that landscape, to providing some deeper water to those trees in our dry climates. So let's take a look at then the tree's response to drought. Basically, when a tree experiences water limitation, whether it's due to an actual drought or just due to improper irrigation, it closes its stomata, or those little pores on the leaves, and photosynthesis slows down. This causes the death of root hairs and feeder roots, resulting in wilting, scorch of leaves on the parts of the tree that were connected to those particular roots and root hairs, and overall defoliation. Ultimately, you get dieback of shoots, and we have a lot of trees in the Reno area that show symptoms like this. This is probably more the rule than the exception. We just see it everywhere, mostly because the trees in our landscapes are entirely dependent on the tree managers for water. During the growing season, we get very little precipitation. When we do get it, it comes as a downpour. A lot of it runs off, and because of our very sandy soils, will percolate below the root system, so that tree doesn't necessarily have access to that water. So we really have to pay attention. Another thing that you'll notice is trees that are undergoing drought will have heavier than normal seed production. That's kind of their last way of preserving their genetic resources, producing seed and maybe producing a new plant later on. So they're kind of on their way to their ultimate death. So my colleagues and I, when I was at Utah State University, my colleagues and I worked on a project where we created a spreadsheet model that showed how much water is used in landscapes with different vegetation profiles. And then we verified that model against observations of water use over 8 years in 3 landscapes in Salt Lake City, Utah. And what we found, and so you'll see on these next 2 slides, this slide and the next slide, is the approximate landscape profile, what types of plants were in that landscape. Both, well, there actually were 3 landscapes. I'm showing you 2. The first one is the turf-dominated landscape, where most of what is in there is 45% of it, almost half of it was turf grass, a few shrubs and some trees, and some of it was hardscape, and mostly irrigated by pop-up sprinklers. That landscape used about 73,000 gallons per year. But you can see when you move then to a woodland-style landscape about the same size, where we have very little turf grass. In fact, I think they took all of the turf grass out of there and had trees and shrubs primarily. We were able to save about 70%. We saw a 70% reduction in water use. So we went down to about 23,000 gallons annually. So the bottom line is that when trees are substituted for turf grass, they not only save water, but they also provide other services by cooling our homes, our cities, sequestering carbon, and reducing energy consumption. And all of these are really critical factors when you think about urban areas and you think about our entire country becoming hotter, or even the world becoming hotter, and in our area less precipitation. We really require trees in order to keep urban areas. And so we really need to start paying attention to how we care for them in dry areas. So let's take a look at that. And ideally what you'd want is a tree that is a bit more drought resilient. And what would a drought resilient tree look like? Ideally, the root system would be deep and wide, and that's to provide as much rooting volume as possible. A greater rooting volume allows the tree to access a greater volume of soil water and minimizes toppling that can happen during wind or during periodic flooding events, which we also get here. And to some degree, the tree's rooting depth is genetically predetermined and dependent on the soil texture, but within those constraints, you can actually influence where the roots will grow by optimizing your irrigation. And this is really important. It may not be so obvious in parts of the country or the world where you get precipitation, significant precipitation during the growing season, but it really makes a difference and shows up rather dramatically here in the Southwest, and particularly in western Nevada. So one of the things we think about is, many of you probably know this, when you do irrigate trees, you need to wet 60 to 75% of the tree rooting zone. The goal is to encourage and sustain a root architecture that will support the tree during water limitations. Again, this is really most important in places where there isn't a lot of precipitation during the growing season. In other parts of the country, and where I come from originally in Wisconsin, we never had irrigation around trees. The trees could really survive based on whatever they might get from turf grass irrigation, and even in many cases we didn't even irrigate our turf grass. Everything came from precipitation during the growing season. So it may not be as critical in those areas, but it may become more critical in the future depending on what the pattern of water limitation is seasonally across the country and across the world. So another really important point is that irrigation depth determines to some degree the tree rooting depth. Now, other factors will come to play when it comes to how deep roots will grow, in particular genetics, but also oxygen concentration. So you'll only grow roots as far down as oxygen can penetrate. So if you've got really sandy soils, you might get the ability to form deeper roots. And if you've got more clayey soils, the roots may not grow as deeply because of the lack of pore space for oxygenation. But if you assume that you've got a nice, well-drained soil with plenty of pore space, the depth of your irrigation will determine the depth of rooting within the genetically predetermined depth of that particular tree species. This photo is a tree in an urban area in western Nevada, which survived only with the water that was provided by the turfgrass irrigation in this landscape. When that irrigation system was removed because of system damage, the tree suffered. This one particularly was attacked by insects, and so it had to be removed. And it was a good opportunity for us to take a photo and show you how shallow that root system was, because its main source of irrigation was the shallow, frequent irrigation of turfgrass. And so that's a really important thing, and probably contributed to the decline of this tree. Another important point is that trees need to be irrigated more deeply than other landscape plants. And this chart just gives you an average of the different rooting depths, potential rooting depths of different plant types in a landscape. So tree roots can grow down even further than 24 inches, but they average 18 to 24 inches. That's where most of your water-absorbing roots are going to be. Shrub roots down to about 18 inches, and then you get to herbaceous perennials, maybe 6 to 12, and then turfgrass is the shallowest with only 6 to 8 inches. And again, these are all species dependent. Some of the turfgrasses will have deeper rooting systems. But the point here is that it's really important that you get water more deeply down to the tree roots. If you want a drought-resilient tree, you really have to provide regular water that penetrates the soil 18 to 24 inches. So when you've got trees planted directly in lawns, in our area in particular, you are going to need an occasional deep watering to keep those deeper roots alive and preserve the tree's resilience to potential water restrictions. That is a really critical point in terms of irrigating trees in arid landscapes. This slide kind of gives you an example of how dramatic it can be to have irrigation of turfgrass. The reason that this shows up so dramatically here is it shows the vulnerability of these trees. Because they get most of their irrigation from the irrigated turfgrass behind, and that turfgrass, and I'm going to use the pointer here to show you, that turfgrass, there it is, ends right here. So this is all turfgrass here. Over here, it's just dirt, and there's no turfgrass. And you can see dramatic difference in how these trees, how healthy and how well they survive, depending on how much access their root systems have to the irrigation system to that turfgrass. These trees here are in tree boxes, and probably maybe have an emitter or two around them, and they're probably just 2-gallon-per-hour emitters, which is really typical in our area, which is definitely not enough to give those trees enough water to survive. So that's the only way that they do survive, is with that long irrigation. Another important point for arborists to keep in mind is that there are two aspects to irrigation scheduling. The first is the duration. In other words, how much water to apply, and that determines how deep that water is going to penetrate into the soil. The second aspect is the frequency, how often you apply that water. And how often you apply is going to depend on the rate of evapotranspiration, and this is going to vary throughout the growing season. We really encourage micro-irrigation or drip irrigation around trees because It provides a slow application. You get less loss to evaporation, reduces runoff and leaching, and they're very efficient systems. Importantly, you should know that drip irrigation systems are measured in gallons per hour rather than gallons per minute. And so anytime you put drip irrigation around plants, especially trees, you're going to have to irrigate for much longer periods of time than you would if you were using sprinkler irrigation. Just a little reminder, this is probably something most of you know, how trees lose water is by transpiration, and transpiration starts at the leaves. And although the trees take up water through their fine absorbing roots, that process actually begins at the leaf surface. So as water evaporates from the leaf surface, capillary action will pull those water molecules from below, and this process continues in a near continuous stream within the water conducting tissues of the tree until the suction reaches the roots and pulls water from the rooting zone. And this process will continue as long as there is moisture in the root zone. So the goal of irrigation then is to replace water lost from the soil due to evaporation directly from the soil and from transpiration through the plant. Okay, here is a formula that is commonly used to estimate daily water use for mature trees. It's based on American Society of Civil Engineers guidelines and modified for practical landscape use. And I'm not going to go through this because of lack of time, but just so that you know, the plant area is basically the canopy diameter, and there's a diameter, and there's a formula that goes along with that. And the plant factor has to do with some to do with what type of plant it is, tree versus shrub versus perennial, but also can vary by species. And then your reference evapotranspiration rate, which you can get from data off of, usually each area will have a website where you can get evapotranspiration data from local weather stations. And then that's divided by the system irrigation system efficiency. And again, I don't have time to go through that in more detail, but I actually did the math for Western Nevada, and this chart shows you the number of gallons, excuse me, I'm not there yet, the number of gallons per week used by different plant types dependent on the plant canopy diameter. So as the plant canopy diameter goes up, you have a greater amount of water used. And so, for example, a tree with a canopy diameter of 14 feet then would need about 160 gallons of water per week. And again, this is in our area here in Reno, Nevada. It could differ depending on evapotranspiration rates in the area that you live. And then this gives you an example of how you might use that information. And so you can see, basically, I did the math, and 160, if you take 20 emitters, 2 gallon per hour emitters for 4 hours, 20 times 2 is 40, times 4 is 160. It gives you 160 gallons per week. If you use microspray emitters, which are another version of drip emitters that are kind of a cross between sprinkler systems and drip emitters, you can use fewer emitters, and you can irrigate for a shorter period. This is just a picture of what a microspray emitter looks like. We like to use them because you can use fewer heads to cover large areas, and it's really easy to check for damage due to rodents and other things that might happen. So when you're looking at irrigating your trees, when the trees are young, you want to wet as much of that root ball as possible. You don't want that irrigation line to be right up against the trunk. And the current practice right now is to install drip emitter systems for the mature size of the tree. Rather than waiting for someone to come in and actually move those emitters out, which rarely happens, what we're trying to encourage people to do is to get that emitter, get those emitters in there, enough emitters to cover the needs of that, mature tree. Remember that roots don't seek water, they follow water. So when you look at this photo, it shows you a picture of what it looks like when a tree does not get adequate irrigation early in its life cycle. And here you can see that you aren't getting any significant growth of roots into the native soil. And so this tree failed. It basically just blew over during a windstorm. And here's another picture showing what happens when you put in young trees and you put irrigation systems to fit their needs, but no one ever goes in and moves that irrigation system out or adds more emitters. And so you end up with a situation like this, knowing that your roots are all around here. You've got emitters up here. It's not very effective. And here's a white pine. Obviously, there's one emitter there. That's not enough for that tree. You've got significant drought stress there. So another thing that's really critical to know is that it's not only important how deep you go with your water, but the lateral distribution of that water is critical too, especially, again, in areas where there's no precipitation during the growing season. If you want your trees to actually provide good services for shade and other things, you really need to provide those, put those emitters around the tree rooting zone so that, can't get that, so that water coverage goes at least out to the canopy drip line and usually even beyond that. Those roots can grow well beyond the drip line of that canopy. So that's one way to do it here. Here's another way. This is out of New Mexico State University where they've got emitters around. This is the tree here. And then there's emitters around. And this is the drip line. You can see they've got the emitters well beyond the drip line. And that's so that those trees can actually survive. You won't get the dieback. You won't get the defoliation. And those trees can provide those landscape services that are so critical as our urban areas begin to heat up with climate change. So, and again, a real important point, the depth and distribution of your water application will determine the ultimate architecture of the root system of your trees, especially in areas where you're not getting regular precipitation. And here's another way of looking at how to irrigate trees to provide good lateral distribution of water. So here the irrigation line is in parallel across the rooting zones of both of these trees. It works really great if you've got trees in rows or trees along the side of a building to provide good coverage. And so in summary, basically to keep trees alive in dry, arid landscapes, it's really critical to irrigate trees separately from the turf grass, especially, but from all other plants as well. And one way to do that is to place the trees in a planted island. Not only does that give better access to irrigation, but those trees can also protect one another, can shade one another to some extent under intense sunlight, and can provide some protection from wind. Also, we recommend using drip irrigation to provide a long, slow soaking to at least 24 inches deep and to cover as much of the lateral root zone as possible with your irrigation emitters. And I'll take questions now, but I did want to make you aware those charts that I showed you back in the middle of my presentation come from this book, Water Efficient Landscaping in the Intermountain West. And we did all the math for you, so if you're interested in accessing that book, you can go to this website and you can find different ways to get your hands on it. And I know that we will also be providing you information on the research that we did with the value landscape engineering, looking at the different landscape types with different plant profiles. And with that, I can take questions.